In the last probably 10 years, there's been a lot of research effort looking at how much human edible protein a cow can produce compared to how much human edible protein a cow consumes. And when you go to the rations with higher levels of these co-product feeds, it's very common that cows are producing 2.5 to 3 times more human edible protein in the milk than they're consuming.
Good morning and welcome to the Dairy Podcast Show. This is Mark Thomas from Dairy Health and Management Services, and pleasure this morning to have Dr. Larry Chase with us. Larry, good morning.
Good morning, Mark.
I guess, Larry, I was an undergrad at Cornell from 89 to 93, and then went up to the vet school till 97. So I guess in terms of our primary introduction, it's many years ago.
Right.
And obviously we've had the opportunity over this time, a common program that you guys did that I recall well in our area was the road show.
Right.
Tom and Larry, Tom Overton and Larry, the annual road show going around the state and sharing, what's new, what's current, what do we need to think about, and those topics varied. I recall, when the economy was terrible, it was okay, how do we tighten the belt and get through this? And then when things were better, okay, what are the new and exciting technologies? So Larry, great to see you and connect again. Can you give the listeners a little bit about your background and your very long and successful career?
Thanks for inviting me to be on the podcast, and hopefully we'll share some information that'll be of value to you. I'm a native of Ohio. I got my degrees at the Ohio State University, North Carolina State University, and Penn State University. Came to Cornell in 1975 with an extension research appointment, and really focused on about three things during my time at Cornell: phosphorus levels in rations, higher forage rations, and lower protein rations. And as Mark said, we did a lot of road shows with industry people. I retired 2015, still do some consulting, currently working with a cooperative in Japan. So it still keeps the brain going a little bit. Each year I do a little bit less of this, but I still have to do enough to keep my brain going.
Typical fresh cow incidence of clinical hypocalcemia is 3 to 6%, while subclinical hypocalcemia affects 50% or more mature cows. Based on cutting-edge research, Exelite offers a new approach that is build effective and the ZDUs. For more information, visit www.protecta.com.
Excellent, Larry. Yeah, and certainly as I look back on the information you've provided to the industry, I think your work with phosphorus, instrumental, right? And thankfully, I think in most regions more historical now. We still do run into, in some regions and different parts of the world, the thought that phosphorus is very important for reproductive performance and over supplementing phosphorus. Obviously, all the environmental aspects, but certainly you and your team at Cornell were certainly instrumental in bringing that data to the forefront. Would you say that in most regions of the world that's not a question anymore, or does it still come up?
It still comes up in certain areas, but I think overall, people have gone to some lower levels than they used to feed and found that it does not impair reproduction. If you're still meeting requirements, you're just decreasing the size of the safety factor.
Excellent. And then obviously the environmental control that's become really important in that area.
Right. Yeah.
So in terms of low protein diets, again, I can think back of when I first started doing some nutrition work with Pete Ostrom as my mentor and at the vet clinic in Northern New York, using Spartan and balancing for crude protein. and now our ability to obviously MEMP is nothing new, but amino acid balancing and what's next for the future. So can you give a little background and obviously where you started there, but then also your experiences before we started recording here? We connected a little bit about various regions of either the U.S. or internationally where either different levels of forage or protein, obviously byproduct availability can really change what the ration looks like.
Right. Well, I think what we should do is talk about lower protein, not low protein, because I think people, when you say low, they get scared. But if you say lower, it's more acceptable because you're saying if I can go down 1 or 2 units, that's really progress. And I think the reason we're interested in this, number of reasons. The first one is profitability. Protein is the most expensive part of the purchase feed program. So if we can lower the purchase feed cost, still maintain our productivity, that has a real economic benefit for the dairy producer, because we're improving the efficiency of using nitrogen in the cow, so we don't need quite as much nitrogen or protein. The other area that's really important is the environmental area, because we all know that if we have excess nitrogen going into a cow, we get excess nitrogen coming out the back. That potentially can go either to ammonia, into the air and air quality problems, or it can get into the water and run off and contaminate water supplies or be involved in the algae blooms that we see in some of the lakes at times. And so I think those are the key reasons we're interested in. Can we make more money? Can we be more environmentally friendly with our dairy production system?
And that's certainly a win-win, obviously, on both aspects.
Right. If the dairyman if both sides don't win, it's going to be a problem for us. But in most cases, when we've done this on farms, it's always a win-win for both the sides of the equation. And I can give a couple examples of research a little bit later as we get into the program more.
As you work with some of your clients and obviously advising other nutritionists over many years, what are some of the pitfalls to avoid, if you will, in terms of that approach? Obviously, there's still in certain markets that focus on milk urea nitrogen, and we've seen the acceptable or norm values change quite a bit, but we actually sometimes hear now folks concerned that MUNs are too low, and I guess trying to discuss some of the efficiency factors of when you hit that perfect Rumen balance, and everything's working well, you need some safety factor or margin in there. But can you give us some of the practical aspects of ration balancing in terms of lower protein?
Well, actually, we have to talk a little bit about the difference between crude protein and metabolizable protein. Crude protein is what people are comfortable with, but it's been shown that crude protein is very poorly related to the level of milk production in the herd. Metabolizable protein is much more better related to predicting milk production. Metabolizable protein is a combination of the amount of protein produced in the rumen by the microbes plus the amount of protein in the bypass protein that gets to the small intestine. And 2001 Dairy NRC suggested that we move to balancing rations on metabolizable protein. And since that time, there have been quite a few ration programs that do use metabolizable protein. And it's becoming more common by our consultants in feed industry that they're balancing on metabolizable protein. But at the farm level, we're still talking about crude protein because that's what the farmers understand. So I think as we move through this podcast this morning, we'll talk a lot about crude protein, but behind it, we're always balancing these rations on metabolizable protein to make sure that's met. because we go low protein and we're deficient on metabolizable protein or amino acids, we're going to knock production. And that's the worst thing you can do a dairy farm is lower his milk production. So what we've found from experience, if we balance metabolizable protein, pay attention to amino acids, we can go to levels of protein in high producing herds, less than 16%, some less than 15, and even a few herds at 14. But a lot of things have to be put together in terms of balancing, daily consistency of management, and minimizing variation in feed quality to make the system work to go to the really, really lower levels.
And Larry, I think, from our experience, that's a great point that, all the other aspects of feeding management, consistency, delivery, proper mixing, consistency and forage quality, over the years, I've at times said, you don't need to worry about balancing for amino acids. You need to worry about having feed in front of the cows consistently and enough refusals. So I guess as you work through, developing, formulating these rations and all the things that go into that formulation from the feeding management side, as you said, you get to those lower levels. Obviously, you're needing to use likely some bypass amino acids. Can you give some background on that process in terms of you going lower and then the need to use different products? Obviously, bypass soy products, bypass amino acids, and so forth.
Yeah, as we adjust these rations, the first thing we want to do is maximize rumen fermentation and produce as much microbial protein as possible, because that microbial protein produced in the rumen is about 65% crude protein on a dry matter basis. And it has an excellent balance of amino acids, especially methionine and lysine. And when it gets to the intestine, it's a high bypass and a highly available source of protein. So if I can shift and grow a little bit more microbial protein in the rumen, I don't need to buy quite as much of, say, bypass soy product or, in some areas of the world, blood meal, but some areas can't use blood, obviously. So the first thing we want to do is maximize rumen fermentation. If I can feed corn or barley and make protein, that's a lot better than buying the bypass. You're always going to need some of the bypass soy sources probably, and potentially some amino acids, but we don't want to go there first. We want to do the rumen first, make sure that rumen is working, maximize microbial protein, and we should be able to get more than half of our total metabolizable protein need produced in the rumen by the bugs, and that helps us both economically and rumen health.
Excellent. And, I certainly recall in my transition of going from the, early days of the Cornell model, CNCPS, from Spartan, and being intrigued to what extent I could make more MP allowable milk by feeding more, like you said, starch, corn, barley, what have you. So, those are not new concepts now, but I think for some of our listeners who are maybe day to day not balancing rations, a really important concept of feeding the rumen, and potentially to have more MP, you don't need to feed more protein, you need to feed more energy.
Right. So, I think the progression is maximize the rumen to get the microbial protein as good as you can, then bring in some of the high quality bypass soy sources, and then after that, there still is a potential then you may bring in some amino acids. So I think you want to do it in that sequence. There's no use going towards the amino acids until we have those other two pieces under control in terms of the logic and cost and so on.
And Larry, that makes obviously a lot of sense to go through that process, especially given the cost of some of those products. Those are obviously high-end, high-cost ingredients. Would you say that, based on your experience, you mentioned working, with the group in Japan, and obviously you have many years of traveling, not only throughout the U.S. but the world. Are there rations that are better suited in terms of different forage formulations, or higher forage versus lower forage, that give you more ability to manipulate these lower protein diets? Or would you say that, in your experience, that a range of diets can successfully be managed as such?
I think we can use the concept of lower protein across forage types and forage levels, but obviously you do need enough room in the ration to provide some room and available carbohydrates to stimulate that microbial protein production and growth. So I think across forages and levels, we can do lower protein. We may not be as low in one system as another, but we can be lower than we were. And so that's a step in the right direction.
And then from the practical aspect, in the process of lowering protein, and obviously you have the paper ration, but what other metrics are you using? Obviously, milk production would be great to chat a little bit about components there, because depending on the markets, especially protein and fat levels in most of the U.S. or all the U.S. as compared to maybe other regions of the world. And then again, getting back to that question, the ideal milk urea nitrogen level to
Yeah.
help in that process of looking at all your parameters, and okay, we've hit the sweet spot, so to speak.
Yeah, at the farm level, obviously, you can look at the milk production, you look at your components, your fat, protein, but the best monitor we really have that's simple is milk urea nitrogen, and at least in the U.S., most of our dairymen get that pretty routinely from their dairy processor. And what we've come up with in New York in our precision feed management program, our guideline is we'd like to have the milk urea nitrogens between 8 to 12 milligrams per 100 or per 100. And so we see some herds gone down 6 or 7, and they maybe 8 can work that okay. I think if you get lower than 6 or 7 in many herds, that's a scary one. So we're bracketing, say, 8 to 12, and I think that's a reasonable range that most of our herds can hit and still be efficient and have good reproduction and not be compromising anything on the animal.
Excellent. I guess those are the ranges that we would aim for, certainly also. So and likewise, those really low levels, perhaps you've hit that sweet spot, but there's no margin of error, right? There's no wiggle room there if you get into some different quality forage, what have you.
I think Mike Van Hamburg would say if you get lower than 6, you're probably starving the rumen, or there's something that's you're compromising the system. So, that range of whether it's 7 or 8 at the bottom is probably debatable, but much lower than that, I think we're taking a risk of causing some challenges or losing some productivity.
We chatted also a little bit about forage percentage in rations, and lower crude protein rations and then higher forage rations. So obviously the key to that is excellent quality, storage, particle size, all those things that our listeners are well aware of. But what are some of your experiences in terms of maximizing forage utilization, both the practical aspect and then obviously the economics?
Practical aspect, I think, is in terms of the forage quality, we need a system where we have a consistent supply of highly digestible forage for the animals. That's the key to using a higher forage ration. And there's a lot of debate about what levels and so on, but we see herds and getting up to 65-70% forage on corn silage based rations, and that's mainly Northeast Midwest type herds. Actually, the highest herd in the United States, which is about 44,000 pounds of milk per cow, they run between 63 and 68% forage routinely, but forage consistency is just top notch, and daily management top notch. So whenever you push the envelope on any of these nutrients or forage, if you don't have quality and consistency and minimize variability, you're opening the door to risk and a lot of problems. So it takes a lot of good daily management plus consistency of feed quality to really push the envelope on all these systems.
And Larry, with over the years, the increased use of BMR, different hybrids, higher digestibility forages, lower lignin alfalfa. Can you give some comments there of just further maximizing the ability to really increase forage levels?
Well, again, I think all you're doing there is you just got a forage that's more digestible, which means the animal gets more nutrients in the rumen out of that forage per unit of forage you're feeding. And so that, since it's more digestible in the rumen, its rate of passage is a little bit higher, so we can get more into that rumen in a given period of time. So like BMR consistently, if you look at all the literature, it generally will, improve milk production 4, 5, 6 pounds potentially. The low lignin alfalfas have the potential to do that. There's not quite as much data there, but all we're doing is getting more quality forage through the rumen in a certain period of time, and that's when we can use things like the indigestibility of the forage or the nutrient digestibility as our indexes of forage quality.
In terms of, I always try to remind sometimes our producers when perhaps there's some inventory issues and we're being pushed to feed lower forage rations. And I think I mentioned before we hopped on, here in Mexico, we're accustomed to, in some cases, feeding rations that are quite low forage, given availability or forage quality, sometimes into the low 30s. And we can do that successfully, but carefully. But I think, not forgetting that we're feeding ruminants. These are cows, they have a forage requirement. So I guess a little bit in the discussion of, not feeding low protein, but lower protein. On the other end, there's no magic number, how low is too low, but what are some of your experiences in other parts of the country compared to the Northeast of, the feeding lower forage rations?
Well, if you look at the two areas that probably in the U.S. have generally lower rations are the Southeast, like Florida, and the western part, like California. And if you look at the California dairies, for example, a lot of those dairies buy in much of their alfalfa, and alfalfa can be expensive. Plus, in California, they have a lot of very good byproduct feeds that are available at relatively reasonable cost. So in many cases, it's to their economic advantage to feed a little bit less forage and take more advantage of the co-product or byproduct feeds. And so quite often you'll see the California rations, many of them be, 35, 40% forage, and they're making that work very well because they're balancing with the others. The key thing on the low forage ration you can't feed high levels of starch with a low forage ration, or you'll tip that rumen environment and drop the rumen pH and get into some potential acidosis situations. So you have to be a little careful on the starch levels with the lower forage rations. But properly managed, some of those California herds make a lot of milk. Some of the Florida herds make quite a bit of milk, and if you go to some of like Israel, they tend to feed rations that are 30 to 40% forage, a lot of co-product feeds, because the alfalfa is expensive, and they've got the highest average milk production of any country in the world. So But again, it's just management to make this whole system work. So many of the things we talk about in nutrition are really, really interesting, but management is such a big factor that can override many of the principles that we keep talking about.
And that would be our experience here in Mexico, Larry. Most rations are in that lower range that you're mentioning, and again, moderate starch rations, feeding more sugars, and obviously the consistency, the quality, all the other aspects that would go into reducing a subclinical acidosis risk for certain. Based on your comment and some of the background that you provided to us in terms of the role of dairy cattle in producing human edible protein, so dairy cattle nutrition. I guess recently, driven a little bit by my sister who really pays attention to her nutrition, I've been paying more attention to my own macros, and I realize it's really hard for me to meet my protein requirement in a day that's being recommended. 160 grams of protein is not easy for me to consume. Salmon, tuna, a steak, chicken. So one, it's making me feel good that I can eat more, but I'm realizing that it's not an easy task to consume that much protein in a day, and that's what's for my age and activity and so forth, the recommendation. So I guess along those lines, interested on some of the things that you're working in that area.
In the last probably 10 years, there's been a lot of research effort looking at how much human edible protein a cow can produce compared to how much human edible protein a cow consumes. And when you go to the rations with higher levels of these co-product feeds, it's very common that cows are producing 2.5 to 3 times more human edible protein in the milk than they're consuming. And so that's really a great advantage for the industry, and a good reason to use those co-products. And I think most consumers aren't aware that cows have the ability to make that conversion. And that's really fantastic news for the industry to tell people that we're taking a feed that's not usable by you or I, and we're ending up with this high quality human edible protein, milk or meat, that fits right into our diet. So I think it's a story that's still developing, but it's something we need to be talking about more with our consumer friends as to how this cow's really helping sustainability of this whole system. Because the option is landfill these, and that wouldn't be very good.
That's a great point, Larry, and I think we talk lots, as we travel to conferences or just sit next to someone randomly in the airplane or what have you, different folks that are not within the industry, the importance of delivering that message, right? That there's still folks who think that the use of land for feeding cattle is not good use of that land and so forth, and that's a whole nother podcast, right? But
right.
I think that's a really important point, and we're not going to, I guess, debate a plant-based diet, but I guess my little short trial here of keeping track of macros has made me also realize, gee, I don't know how I would begin to do that eating a plant-based diet. If I can't do it with fish, chicken, and beef, gosh, what I would be well stuffed on lentils to try to make it there.
Right. And I think the other thing on the lower protein, we have to look at some economics. And I'll just give one example of a research trial to give you an index. A few years ago, Delaware County Cooperative Extension in New York got a grant to look at some herds in the upper Susquehanna watershed, which feeds Chesapeake Bay, to see what we could do to lower nitrogen and phosphorus. So we used 8 herds over a 3-year period of time. There were 4 feed companies involved and 2 consultants in feeding these herds. And we let the rations were formulated by the feed industry person working with the herd in consultation with our Cornell group and the Delaware County group. So we'd talk about it. If they'd agree to do this or that, they would adjust the rations. So we wanted the feed industry people to be heavily involved in the project. What really happened, in simple terms, the average protein went from 17.5% to 15.8% over that 3-year period in those herds. Milk production per cow varied a pound or two, but it didn't really change at all. And the really important thing is income over purchase feed cost went up $137 per cow per year. And we reduced nitrogen in manure by 15%. So here's a good example, and we've done this a number of times in herds. We can lower the protein, we can improve profitability, and we can decrease the environmental impact all at the same time. So that's just one quick, simple example of what this can mean to a dairyman in terms of economics.
Obviously, a great win-win as we start discussing more about the environmental aspects, the reduction of methane production, and additives that are available and so forth. I think where's the economic return? So we can feed a feed additive perhaps and reduce methane production, but then where's the win for the dairy producer? If that doesn't make more milk or make improved conversion, where is the money going to come from to pay for such an additive, as opposed to these strategies of feeding more forage, lowering protein, having that effect, phosphorus also, as we go back to that, but I think right. Most herds are in that region. The same level or maybe a greater impact on the carbon footprint that are then also a win-win in terms of production and profitability.
Yeah, we've done some work in carbon footprint too to another project, and if we put together best management practices for both feeding the cow and manure management in this scenario that we did with the whole farm analysis that Dr. Al Rotz at Penn State did it, we could take the carbon footprint from 1 unit of carbon equivalent per kilogram of milk down to 0.6. So that's a pretty dramatic drop by implementing both feed management and manure management practices on a dairy farm. Those are good. Those are possibilities out there that we can do. It's just getting all of this stuff put together and implemented correctly and so on. Yeah.
Daryl Neidham and Caitlin Briggs recently presented at the bovine practitioners meeting, just modeling milk production and also cow longevity, and looking at one cow, if you will, the output of that one cow, and obviously, the efficiency of higher milk production, a lower carbon footprint, and the importance of optimizing milk production. Always careful about maximizing, especially with quotas now and supply management, but optimizing milk production and obviously striving for that most maximum income over feed cost.
Yep.
It's time for our famous 3. Evonik Animal Nutrition is committed to ensure food security and safety while reducing the ecological footprint of animal farming. Its products and services use evidence-based solutions that seek to promote animal welfare and reduce reliance on natural resources. All this is underpinned by long-standing industry partnerships and deep customer understanding. Evonik's focus on efficiency, sustainable, healthy nutrition, and collaborations with livestock farming partners creates value for customers and consumers.
Larry, as we wrap up our discussion here this morning, there's a few questions that we generally ask our presenters, and one is as you look with the herds, and you have many years of experience and throughout the world, of what sets aside the progressive producer, and I think I like to say, who has longevity in the industry, right? The herds that are going to be that have made it this long and are either themselves or the generation, family, the business will continue. What are some of the characteristics of those folks that really set them apart?
I think a key thing is they have an attention to detail and consistency of management across these herds. They really, all of our dairymen want to do a good job. These people really want to do a good job for both themselves and their cows and the environment. But I think it's that attention to detail, consistency that really drive these type of herds.
Yeah, and I think that's a great, yeah. The cow's best day is if she's bored, right? Everything is the same, milking
Right.
time, feeding, so forth. So, great point. In terms of a reference that you really go to as we, it's fun to kind of recommend to the audience. There's a wide range from websites to textbooks to journals and so forth. But what's one of your go-to references for dairy?
I'd like to go to the American Dairy Science Association has a program, SPAC, which is a compilation of all the different conference proceedings. So I usually go to conference proceedings like the Cornell, the Penn State, Tri-State. Those are good starting points, I think. But there's a lot of good conferences around the world. So I think conference proceedings right now are probably our key references that people are using because they're the most up-to-date, most current, and they have cutting-edge stuff. So that's usually where I go to start with conference proceedings.
Larry, I think you're the first to mention that, and I really like that and appreciate that because, where are we getting the most up-to-date information, before Journal of Dairy Science or other publications, right? Invited speakers, either from industry, from, private sector, or obviously from university. They're going to present some of that early work at conferences, and unfortunately, those don't always get picked up to the same. They're not a peer-reviewed publication. So I really like that, and that's a great opportunity for the audience. And that's international, also, correct? So then you have
Right.
a range of not just U.S. based, but work that's going on in other parts of the
Right. You can pick up
world.
other parts of the world too. Yeah. Because there's some good work going on in different parts of the world also that we need to be aware of. Yeah. A lot of the co-product work started out in Austria and Sweden to get people excited about that human edible protein, which is now getting attention in a lot of areas of the world, but started over in Europe, basically.
And that's a great point. One, the industry is global; it's not local. There's exports, imports, so forth. But I think also, as we look at animal welfare, if we look at antimicrobial, antibiotic use, environmental standards, there seems to be that often start in Europe and work its way to North America, Canada, Mexico, and then somewhat of the rest of the world. So being on top of what's happening in the rest of the world is super important for our industry, and I think really important that producers recognize that. It's think globally in terms of your business, and then you're more in retirement mode now, so I assume you have other hobbies and things going on. Like to wrap up with any recent documentary, book, something of interest that I think often we can take some of those concepts and relate them to dairy also, but outside of dairy, outside of feeding cows, any recommendations for the audience?
Well, I think everybody just has to find for themselves what is of interest to them. We're doing a little bit of traveling that we didn't do before. We're in the middle of a house remodeling right now, and we're doing some genealogy, and we got pictures from both sides of the families to sort through. So, everybody has different ideas and different thoughts, but that's sort of what we're doing at this point in time. And, spend more time with the grandkids too. So, everybody has to find their niche, I guess.
Great. No, I think, that's obviously really important. And for those that are not on the retirement side of their career, still finding that time to disconnect a little bit and think outside the box, I guess, think outside of our industry and what concepts we could use from either, personal well-being or other industries. So Larry, again, great to reconnect with you after many years of being the mentee of many of your research projects and your programs and your investigations in terms of especially in the Northeast during my time there. So again, thank you for the audience, Dr. Larry Chase. And certainly, if any questions come up, I'm sure we can get you Larry's contact
Yep,
and email.
that'll work. We can do that. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
You have a great afternoon, and again, thanks for your time connecting.
Okay. Thanks,
Thanks
Mark.
to all. Thank you, and thanks to all for joining the Dairy Podcast Show.